indudablemente es un esfuerzo muy grande por parte de la organización y bueno, hay que estar a un nivel muy alto debido a los ponentes que tenemos. Desde luego, sí os puedo asegurar que es un orgullo pues, el traer a los ponentes y a nivel profesional de esta gente vamos a tener. A ver si, por favor, vamos bajando el tono. Gracias. Bueno, en el día de hoy el programa se va a la primera parte, va a ser de incubación. Las dos primeras ponencias van a ser en inglés y hay traducción simultánea. Después tendremos un descanso y podréis dejar los equipos de traducción a la salida cuando vayamos a tomar el refrigerio o el desayuno. Y luego habrá otro grupo de ponencias sobre incubación que serán todas en castellano. Por otro lado, sabéis que una de las filosofías nuestras es que además de pues, dar un nivel muy elevado por los ponentes de temas muy específicos, como es el tema en este caso de hoy de la mañana de incubación, pues también yo creo que es un momento en que por el número de profesionales que nos hemos montado aquí, pues indudablemente también podemos intercambiar opiniones y ayudarnos a abrazos de amistad de que algunos pues indudablemente no nos vemos hace tiempo. Vale. Sí, os quiero recordar, por favor, es tema de puntualidad. Vemos que nosotros somos los primeros en fallar, pero vamos a ver si podemos ir recuperando. Recordaros, por favor, el tema de los móviles, ponerlos en migración. No vaya a ser que a alguno le suene el himno de algún equipo o algo cuando suene. Entonces, por favor, apagarlos o ponerlos en migración para no incordiar a los demás. El tema de las preguntas, ya sabéis cómo funcionamos. Habrá una página en la cual vosotros podéis entrar, que la tenéis, incubaforum.org, y a través de la web os saldrá la posibilidad de hacer las preguntas. Se pueden ir haciendo sobre la marcha y al final de la ponencia, pues nosotros las respondremos aquí. Sabéis que son anónimas, no hay ningún problema, las vais poniendo directamente con la red wifi que el hotel nos da. En principio, luego ya os pasaré a presentaros a los ponentes, pero sí quiero que bueno, nuestro cabeza y nuestro director, Luis Carrasco, os dirija unas palabras de bienvenida y os haga una pequeña presentación. Luis, por favor.
Hola, buenos días. Como José os quiero dar la bienvenida a Madrid y la bienvenida a Síguenos, a nuestro proyecto. Aunque la mayor parte de los que estamos aquí, tanto de incubación y de reproductoras, somos ya casi amigos todos, la verdad es que es un honor para mí teneros a todos aquí y para el equipo de ellos, y nos da mucho respeto tener este nivel que tenemos hoy aquí. Esperamos estar a la altura. Entonces, os voy a dar 4 cifras. Hoy van a estar más o menos unas 320 personas aquí, en total unas 400 entre los 2 días. Esta edición, que es la tercera de incubación, si no me equivoco, aunque parece que hace mucho tiempo, en el fondo el primer incubaForum lo empezamos en el 2014. En noviembre de 2014, el hotel que está justo aquí al lado, el Hotel AC, empezamos con unas 170, 180 personas y yo creo que este año ya ha sido el año que en general, y por muchos comentarios de vosotros, es el que hemos ya de alguna manera consolidado el proyecto de incubación en Madrid y en España, en agricultura. En el 2014 tuvimos la visión de hacer jornadas muy especializadas, no mezclar termopatología, manejo, incubación, reproductores, porque al final cada vez somos más profesionales, cada vez las empresas estamos más dedicados a una tarea en concreto, y esa que ya hemos cogido y esperamos seguir así en los próximos años. Tengo un par de novedades que les quiero comentar. Antes de la primera de ellas, el programa de incubación ha sufrido diferentes movimientos de fechas. Empezamos en noviembre, después nos fuimos a marzo, ahora subimos a junio. Sé que esto es mejor establecerlo una fecha para que todo el mundo tenga claro que cada año es la misma fecha. Vamos a establecerlo en mayo, en principio, a partir de ahora. Aparte en mayo, el año que viene, la idea que tenemos es no se va a realizar en Madrid, vamos a ir de Madrid, todavía no, porque más o menos tenemos claro dónde va a ser, hasta que no tengamos todo bien atado, no preferimos no comunicarles para que no se apunte la agenda. Pero va a ser en la ciudad española también, y se va a hacer, si todo sale bien, bueno, más que junto, en paralelo con una jornada de nutrición. No nutrición, en nutrición en animal, porcino, agricultura y bovino, que normalmente viene vinculada, nosotros lo realizamos cada año en Lérida, junto al porcino. El problemita que hemos tenido, por decirlo de alguna manera, este año en Lérida es que hemos tenido 100 personas en porcino y nutrición y ha sido bastante complicado gestionarlo, y hemos pensado que la agricultura y la nutrición pueden ir en paralelo en la ciudad española, y supongo que en octubre, septiembre-octubre ya lo comunicaremos. Una de las novedades que tenemos este año es un señor que tengo delante, que es una pequeña camarita que tenemos justo delante. Nosotros a los compañeros de América Latina, a los peruanos que hay uno por aquí, tenemos un peruano por aquí, a los colombianos, a los latinoamericanos, que como sabéis todos tenemos un proyecto importante allí, y los que no han podido venir, les queremos brindar la posibilidad, aunque ahora es un poquito pronto para ellos, de verlo en directo. Se están grabando en directo a través de la fanpage, si no me equivoco, de aviForum. Y si en Facebook se conectan a la fanpage de aviForum, podrán ver la charla con el audio perfecto y ahí se enterará todo grabado. En todo esto, quizás las personas que son más visibles para realizar todo esto somos José Luis y yo, quizás, en el sector avícola, pero todo esto es imposible sin el equipo que tenemos detrás, que es lo más importante de esta empresa. Somos 18 personas y mientras voy hablando, que son solo 3 minutos, voy a tener que poner un vídeo así que vais conociendo detrás. Y son las personas que han sido capaces de organizar 6 congresos el año pasado en España. Y este año también, sí, congresos van a organizar este año en España. Son de estas personas de aquí. El secreto, ustedes lo dicen, claro, aviForum es una empresa que tiene 4 años de vida, no llega todavía. Entonces el secreto que hemos tenido para no morir en el intento, sobre todo es el trabajo de las 18 personas, el trabajo, y los detalles. La media de edad que tiene aviForum en su equipo es 31 años. Como podéis imaginaros, yo no se ríe porque vemos un poquito esta media, y el 60% de la empresa es femenino. O sea, tenemos más porcentaje de mujeres que de hombres en aviForum, y es un orgullo para nosotros. Finalmente, tenemos a los directores de ellos, algunos los conocéis. Finalmente, voy a acabar esta presentación hablando de un proyecto muy importante para nosotros y que va a ser clave en los próximos años. Hemos empezado desde septiembre de 2015 como objetivo, como aviForum, focalizarnos en el mercado latinoamericano como proyecto. Hemos tenido la suerte, una enorme suerte, y aunque hoy no puede estar aquí, en noviembre vendrá a Guillermo Zavala como director técnico de la revista News en América Latina. Tenemos a nuestra compañera Natalia en Buenos Aires, que lleva toda la parte comercial, a María Ángeles en Chile, la periodista de aviForum, sitio de allí, y el nuevo proyecto en Brasil, con 2 personas en Brasil, porque ya aviForum tiene edición en portugués para Brasil. Brasil es como todo el resto de países latinoamericanos, de solito, y consideramos que tiene suficientemente fuerza como para tener su propia revista. Así que hemos entrado a competir y disfrutar con nuestros amigos brasileños de Brasil y de España, y finalmente eso supone ya el 25% de nuestra empresa, el proyecto latinoamericano, y finalmente otro proyecto que es el Finalia, que tenemos ya entre manos y estamos ya trabajando. El año que viene nuestra principal motivación, bueno, quizás no me he expresado bien, nuestra principal motivación, uno de los grandes proyectos que tenemos en esta empresa es un aviForum, organizarlo en América Latina, a todos los países latinoamericanos. Hemos empezado y se les invitará oportunamente. Por mi parte, muchas gracias por venir, espero que disfruten, y si algo hemos hecho mal, espero que lo disculpen y el próximo año lo haremos mejor. Muchas gracias.
Ya os han presentado la guardería, entonces yo soy el más responsable, lógicamente. Así que voy a empezar a presentaros al primer ponente para ir entrando en materia. Por favor, Chuck Daniels es nuestro primer ponente. Él es graduado en el Instituto Técnico Northwest de Arkansas, especialista en controles eléctricos, automatismos y refrigeración. Lleva 28 años de experiencia en la industria agrícola, actualmente es director de desarrollo de negocio de I+D de Chickmaster, al cual agradecemos a Chickmaster el patrocinio del ponente. Por favor, Mr. Daniels, come here.
incubaForum and aviForum, and of course Avenues for inviting us here to speak today. It's a great pleasure. I've had the opportunity to be reintroduced to several people that I know here, and of course several new people, and it is my pleasure. I will begin with talking about ventilation. I hope you find several things interesting in this presentation. Of course, for the beginning, basically it's simple. We just turn eggs into chicks, right? So for starting with the basics, in the process of incubating eggs, ventilation is extremely critical. Understanding the embryo, requirements of development, for the most part, from a ventilation perspective, we understand there's a tremendous aspect associated around incubation, but for the most part, there are some basic principles that we have to deal with. To begin with, we talk about temperature, obviously humidity, turning, oxygen, and CO2. And from a critical application standpoint, those are the things we have to focus on to be capable of incubating successfully at a high rate of percent and to produce a good quality chick. Break that down a little bit further. From a temperature standpoint, we recognize that the embryo in the beginning is endothermic, requiring heat. It has to be warmed up. Exothermic in the end. The embryo requires higher temperature in the beginning and a lower temperature in the end. The temperature becomes a function that requires control, adding heat in the beginning and removing heat in the end. When we talk about humidity, we recognize that as the embryo essentially incubates, it's affected by internal moisture. As the embryo develops and becomes exothermic, and the embryo consumes more oxygen and produces CO2, the gas exchange through the shell, you get moisture loss with that. So therefore, becomes an exothermic, it increases moisture loss, and moisture around the egg then becomes an increase. It's another point of control. When we talk about turning, obviously, that's a pretty simple piece. Required to keep the yolk from settling through the albumin, attaching itself to the shell. By turning, it also allows full development of the choriolymphoid membrane, having adequate development of the vascular system. And, you know, in nature, the hen only turns the egg a few times, every few hours, as opposed to how often we turn in the incubator. So we oftentimes run trials and tests and concern ourselves with how often we turn, and we find that in most cases, because of some of the early commercial incubation, we found that turning was much easier on an hourly basis, but it's not a requirement for the embryos, but it is for the incubation in order to make sure that we have adequate airflow to all eggs inside of a machine. When we get past turning, we talk about oxygen. And oxygen for the embryo is a nutrient. And that's how we consider that. So oxygen consumption begins with the development of the vascular system. The consumption increases proportionally as the embryo develops. Therefore, as the embryo consumes oxygen, it produces CO2. CO2, then, as a byproduct of oxygen consumption, also increases proportionally as the embryo develops. CO2 exposure at specific times enhances the development of the embryo. Again, this becomes a function of control. So when we look at it from an incubation standpoint, we focus on the fact that during incubation, we basically put the embryo into an incubator. We enclose it into this cabinet. And we put this incubator then into an incubator room, or a setter room, or a corridor. And then where's this corridor? In today's theory or basis of design, it's inside of a hatchery. So we have an embryo that's in an incubator, that's in an incubator room, that's inside of a hatchery, and the ventilation becomes an effect of what goes on from an ambient standpoint, the atmosphere around the facility. And therefore the ventilation becomes imperative, as it's important in order to be capable of providing the embryo that again is inside of the incubator room that's inside of the hatchery, in order to provide it with all of the desired requirements. So while we see temperatures that go up and down outside, we also see humidity that changes continuously outside of a facility. So to take it a little bit further, in the beginning, it was relatively simple. Yes, very small applications. A major advancement occurred when we put an alarm system on the incubator. So that way, if we had a problem, it would tell us if there was an issue. Real problems with incubation and ventilation came along with commercialization. You know, in order to be effective as a producer, you must be cost effective. And cost effectiveness comes from size. The ability to put a large volume of eggs into a small space on a small amount of square footage becomes a cost factor. And so it allows us to be more efficient. But it creates major issues when we talk about providing enough oxygen, removing enough heat, providing enough ventilation for that incubation equipment. So when we look at a machine today, when we talk about the first three principles or the requirements for basic incubation, we know that pretty much all incubation equipment, even old incubation equipment, is capable of providing temperature control, also humidity control, and the turning. The incubators are capable of doing that. But what about oxygen and CO2? You know, without the ventilation system providing this from the room, the incubator can't provide oxygen on its own. It's not going to remove the CO2 without the oxygen. So that becomes a function and a requirement of the ventilation system. So when we look at ventilation for incubation, we recognize that through the 21 days of incubation, there's a small volume of oxygen consumption and CO2 production in the beginning. When you hit about day 10, day 11, we see a huge spike in the oxygen consumption. This is occurring because the embryo is developing at a rapid rate at this point. And with this rapid growth, you have heat production, you have the oxygen consumption as a nutrient, and then you have the CO2 production. If we essentially put eggs into an incubator and we don't ventilate it, we're not going to have the ability to produce an embryo because of the lack of the nutrient oxygen. So ventilation in the incubation process produces several things. It provides us with oxygen for the incubation, the depletion of CO2, and the thing to recognize there is we are depleting CO2. We're not replacing, essentially getting rid of it, we're depleting it. When we provide ventilation, oxygen into an incubator, it displaces the level of CO2 that's there. Because as we provide oxygen in the form of ventilation into an incubator, air must exhaust out of the incubator. And so therefore that air exchange rate is what depletes the CO2, thus allowing us to control the oxygen. We have the heat removal, because as the development continues, it produces more heat, as we show in the graph. And the air exchange then through the machine provides a level of heat removal. Ventilation also provides us the ability to remove moisture. Like we mentioned earlier, as the embryo develops and the gas exchange, we have this high level of moisture that's being produced by the developing embryos. So the ventilation allows us to remove the moisture. And if we do all of these things correctly, then we're providing the ideal conditions for setters and hatcher machines. And also ventilation becomes a key role with biosecurity of the hatchery. And last but not least, it also provides us with an opportunity for embryonic heat in order to conserve energy. So that's the basis in theory of why we ventilate a hatchery and why there's such a strong necessity for this, and the difficulties that come with today's equipment because of the physical size and the characteristics of the incubation equipment. So we talk about a little bit further to take this to the next level. Want to look at the basics. You know, by definition, ventilation is simply nothing more than to introduce fresh air into a given room or a given building. So basically, if this room was completely closed and I go over and open that window, I am providing ventilation to this room. It's not going to be very effective, but by definition, I'm providing ventilation to this room. And as you see in the illustration, to advance on that ventilation, the concept was initially is we don't force air in, but we'll put an exhaust fan on the wall on the other side of the room, and when we turn it on, we will pull air into the room. So now we have what we reference as a more of a mechanical ventilation system, a forced ventilation system. And so in the beginning, this is all we knew. But the problem we have with this is, as I showed earlier, the increasing and decreasing temperatures of the atmosphere. It's not always applicable to provide straight ambient air directly into incubation equipment. Same thing with humidity. So to advance this, we got a little bit smarter. We said, well, maybe we need to try to cool this air off a little bit. We have a lot of heat in the incubator, so let's cool it off. So our next step, if you look at it, we see a lot of old systems that had forced air input in the form of an evaporative cooler. And you still see a tremendous volume of this type of ventilation systems in the market today, in all parts of the world. But with water in this unit, it allows the evaporation of the water and therefore it cools the air. So now we have a cooler room. But it also adds moisture. So in applications where it's a very humid climate, this is not a very applicable system. But it worked. As time went by, we've advanced, and we see equipment that came along back 20, 30 years ago that were packaged units. A unit similar to this, in this fashion, this unit has the capability of providing heat. It has a capability of cooling the air. And it also has the ability, number one purpose, is to bring in fresh air. And you see that in a unit like this when you look at the hood that's on the outside. It physically pulls air in from the outside. So this is a packaged unit. And this in essence, when it came along, required a new level of control. We didn't just have a switch on the wall where we turn off and on an exhaust fan or off and on an evaporative cooler. We now have to control the modulating fresh air, control the heat, control the cooling. So as time's gone by, this is what we see. You go into a lot of hatcheries today where this is the level of control that they have on every single room to control all those various aspects. So the complications around ventilation have become very critical. In the world of designing ventilation today, that aspect of not only providing the correct volume of air, but the right amount of heating capacity, the right amount of cooling capacity, and the ability to control the pressures become very critical. So when we look at ventilation in a whole, I think it's pretty simple for most people in here to recognize the temperature and to recognize the humidity. Yes, there are critical points there of saying it should be this temperature and it should be this humidity. But what I find in essence, in order to control the fresh volume of air coming into a room through the incubation equipment, the volume of air coming into a chick room and being provided to the chicks in a holding area, this is all a matter of controlling pressure. So to begin with, I want to speak a little bit more about pressure. And let's talk about some of those details so everybody has a better understanding of it. The thing about pressure and what you have to recognize is that we know with temperature, it's a point. I have one point. It's a probe, or it's a mercury stack, and it basically tells me what temperature is. Same thing with humidity. We're either measuring as a wet bulb, or we're measuring it as a relative humidity. But essentially, it's just one probe. When we talk about pressure, the thing we have to recognize at the hatchery level is that pressure, when we realize that by measuring and controlling, we're controlling what? Differential. Because pressure is not just one point. Pressure is a reference between 2 points. So if I want to know what the pressure in this room is, I say the pressure in here may be a 0.015 or it may be 2.5 pascals, but it's in reference to another point. So in applications at the hatchery level, for us to start controlling pressures, we have to have pressure from a standpoint of a reference. So in most cases in hatcheries today, what we look at is we look at the atmosphere. So the atmosphere becomes our reference. If we say this room is, 10 pascals positive, it's positive in reference to atmosphere. So in order to control a positive room, when you look at an incubator or a hatcher, and you turn this machine on here, it will start to consume air from the room. If we don't provide fresh air in the room, what happens to the room? It gets negative. So in order to maintain a positive pressure in the room, we have to control the room positive, but we reference that room to the atmosphere. So always keep that in mind when you talk about ventilation at your hatchery. It's a reference between 2 points when you're controlling pressure. If somebody says, what's your room pressure? It's 7 pascals in reference to the atmosphere. I do find some hatcheries today, because I visit a lot of hatcheries throughout the year and provide technical assistance in incubation and in ventilation, and I find many hatcheries that have room references that don't reference to the atmosphere. They reference to an attic space, or they reference to a known room somewhere. And in a lot of cases, they're not controlling their ventilation process very well. It's very inefficient, they lack oxygen, they have too much CO2, and it's because of references. So always remember with pressure, by controlling it, we're controlling differential. So let's talk about the plenum. We know in order to get air through that machine, we have to have an exhausting system because of the heat, the humidity, the CO2 that exhausts from the machine. Whether it's exhausting into a ducted system or whether it's exhausting into a pressure control plenum, in order to control the pressure in that plenum, again, we have to have a control point and it has to have a reference. So in today's society, we see most systems that have a pressure that references from the plenum to the room. And the reason we see that is because that then becomes your known differential. So if my plenum is a negative 30 pascals in reference to the room, the incubator has the fresh air inlet is in the positive and the exhaust is in the plenum, so therefore the differential across the machine is a negative 30 pascals. That becomes your control point. I do see some hatcheries, not as many today, but some hatcheries that reference the plenum to the atmosphere. And this is okay, it works. The reason I prefer to have a plenum reference to the room is because we know that our atmosphere reference oftentimes can be affected by many things, such as heavy rain, heavy wind. Wind especially causes your pressure sensors to be inconsistent. And so by letting the plenum reference to the room, it takes away that one piece of connectivity to the atmosphere, and therefore it allows it to be more stable. And what you'll see is as a room pressure goes up and down, because someone opens the door, the plenum that is more negative here will go up and down and follow with it. But what's in the middle? The incubation equipment. So you have a consistency of differential across the machine. If the plenum references to the atmosphere, it's here and it's stable, but the room is doing this. Somebody opens the door, somebody leaves the doors propped open during transfer or egg setting, then the room is low, but the plenum doesn't change. But you lose differential across your machine. So the machines that aren't being affected during that process are being affected because they're not getting as much air through them because you've affected the differential pressure. So it's very critical to understand differential and the fact that that's what pressure is. It's a reference of 2 points. When we look at older equipment from an incubation standpoint, predominantly throughout the world, decades ago, we saw incubation equipment that was primarily considered multi-stage equipment. So there's multiple stages of embryonic development in that machine at all times. And most of that equipment at that time was designed to basically self-ventilate. So it's called, I generally reference to them as a self-ventilating machine. Any machine that physically produces its own ventilation. And it does that simply when we look at the fact that the interior recirculation fans in the machine have a very negative suction side to them. And this negative suction side generally has an opening to a fresh air inlet. So when you turn this machine on and all these fans start recirculating, it creates a very negative suction above the fan and a very positive below, generally creating a differential in this particular machine of about 30 pascals. So it's self-creating ventilation. It doesn't have to have a room. It doesn't have to have a plenum. You just turn that machine on and air will go through that machine on its own. So we're creating differential with the machine and the equipment that's in the machine. And you see here that we have a controlling point 1 where we reference from the atmosphere to the room, and we're controlling it at 5 pascals. So the room is a positive 5 pascals. As this machine is turned on and starts consuming air, this air supply must speed up in order to keep that room at 5 pascals. As the air exhausts out of the machine into the plenum, this exhaust fan must speed up equally in order to maintain that plenum at what in this case is set as a negative 2.5 pascals. And so those are our 2 control points. We have an atmospheric reference, we have a room reference, we have references from the plenum to the room, but this is a self-ventilating, older style, multi-stage type of equipment. What we see a little bit more today in most applications, various incubation manufacturers are building equipment with internal fans that have one focus. That internal fan focus is to recirculate air throughout the egg mass. There's no wasted horsepower or no wasted kilowatt consumption in order to create that differential. So on a machine that we see commonly today, or a lot of incubation manufactured equipment today, this machine doesn't create, if we look at that, this machine doesn't create a differential pressure. So in order to get air to go through this machine, we have a room pressure control, just like with the multi-stage, but with this particular machine, we have to control the plenum at a greater negative level. But that's equal to the pressures created in the older multi-stage equipment. So in relationship to that, pressure control becomes much more critical as far as being consistent in order to introduce the correct volume of air to the incubator. But the important piece to recognize is some people look at this style of equipment and say, well, now the pressure differential is more critical. Yes, it is. But remember this, the energy efficiency of the incubation equipment is much better because it's only recirculating air through the egg pack. That's its only design. So it can be designed far superior to older equipment that requires not only the fan to recirculate air, but it's requiring the static pressure in order to pull air in. So from a ventilation design standpoint, as the incubation manufacturers have evolved and equipment has become much better at recirculating air internally, for the people who design ventilation systems, that job has become more critical. It must be, a lot more defined. So we take that a little further and we look at some common pressure settings around incubation. We look at setter rooms in general that we try to run at about a 5 Pascal. Exhaust plenums on older classic equipment that are self-ventilating at about a negative 5 Pascal for a plenum. On newer single-stage style equipment, we see plenums that are close to a negative 30 Pascals in order to meet air requirements. We look at hatchers, they're similar. Hatcher rooms about a 0.01 or 2.5 Pascals. The reason we see a little bit of a difference between setter rooms and hatcher rooms from a design standpoint is really our focus around trying to control our pressure cascade, which takes us to the next level. Is how do we design the ventilation in a hatchery to not only meet the incubation needs, but in essence, do more for us, the biosecurity aspect. So when we look at a typical floor plan like this, and this is based on today's style of hatcheries, is our focus is to have more or less egg rooms, setter rooms on one end of the building, and then we transfer into hatcher rooms and have chick processing and chick takeoff on the other end. And that becomes more of a dirty area. So in essence, what we focus on is trying to have higher pressures in a cleaner end of the facility and lower pressures in the dirty end of the facility. So in a controlled climate, as we walk a process through this facility, we create the environment that keeps chick down and keeps dust from processing and keeps airborne bacteria from having the ability to migrate towards the cleaner end of the hatchery, because we don't want to have a crossover contamination that ends up in the incubation, and then we have a bacteria challenge that we don't have the ability to overcome. We take that a little further from an incubation standpoint. I hope you understand well now that we do have to control the process around the setters and the hatchers, and we looked at those pressures earlier, but when we look at egg rooms and we look at transfer rooms and clean rooms and takeoff rooms and chick rooms, these are all very critical as well. And the reason they're critical is because this is where our processing occurs. This is where the majority of our airborne bacteria can be created. And so we see this in these facilities, and you recognize that even though we have a cascade where we try to keep egg rooms and setter rooms more positive than hatcher rooms and chick rooms, inside of that we also have clean rooms that are engulfed around areas that are dirty, places that we don't want to have contamination. So when we look at this, such as this, so here in this hatchery, they receive all of their dirty chick boxes from chick delivery. The boxes come back and they get dumped into here, so that's considered a dirty room. Right next to it is where they get washed and put in here. Well, now they're clean. We don't want that clean room to get contaminated. Same thing here. We have as the chicks get pulled, take off, the dirty baskets come into here, they get washed, and they get stored back in this clean room. We don't want that clean room to operate at a different pressure or a lower pressure than a washroom or any of the dirty areas around it. So all of these rooms, in essence, we have to control the pressure in. So from a ventilation perspective, the first thing I do physically is I measure that room. Dimensions. I look at width, length, height, and I design an air exchange rate. And that air exchange rate, by design then, lets me control the environment in that room. So if I have a room that is 4,000 cubic feet, and I want a 4-minute air exchange rate, I have to put 1,000 CFM into that room. That gives me a 4-minute air exchange rate. So in every 4 minutes, all of the air inside of that room has been exchanged. How do we accomplish that? We supply fresh air into the clean room, and then we put the exhaust fan in the washroom. So that takes everything out of the clean room, through the washroom, it's exhausted there to the atmosphere. And when we do this, we're allowed then to create an environment of having temperature and humidity control in the clean rooms, and yet we use that energy that was provided into those rooms to help ventilate and remove heat from the washrooms. Again, we're controlling pressure, and with pressure differential, it gives us that ability then to be biosecure and to create the correct environment. So in order to take it to the next level, really in order to have control of those rooms, we talk about temperature set points and humidities. And I remember doing ventilation systems 20 years ago in a hatchery, and we sat around and we talked more about temperature. Oh, it has to be this temperature, it has to be this humidity. And as time has evolved, we see that being still critical, but it becomes less of the discussion. The heavier discussion becomes around pressure. Because with the perfect temp and humidity, if we don't control pressure, we don't have the ability to create oxygen levels, and we don't have the ability to create the biosecurity. But in most hatcheries today, these are the level of temperatures and humidity set points that we generally see. So when we look at how critical temperature and humidity control and the function of ventilation is in a hatchery, we start by looking at, say, a graph, and this is a graph of a multi-stage machine. What do we recognize when we look at this graph? The temperature. First off, one set point the entire time. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we have the same exact temperature set point. What that tells us is we should be able to have a room then that has one set point, one temperature. We need that consistency. Same thing around CFM, the volume. On a multi-stage machine, the volume of airflow through it is very consistent. And therefore damper operation on the machine is very consistent. The one point we see here where there was a change, this is when they made an egg set. So they came into a multi-stage machine, you set eggs, the damper closes, because the machine is cool, the damper closes, we cut back on air, lets the machine heat up quickly, and then the damper opens again and we're back to a higher volume of air. So the consistency that's required in a multi-stage does put a demand on the room to be consistent. When we look at a single stage piece of equipment today, the first thing we recognize is in single stage incubation, as the embryo in the beginning requires higher heat, it requires lower temperature in the end in order for us to remove heat. So we see a declining temperature set point for the machine. Therefore, from a CFM standpoint, we know that the embryo in the beginning consumes very little oxygen, and then towards the end, it consumes a great volume of oxygen. Same thing with heat production. So therefore, the damper, as we progress through hatch, opens wider. The air volume increases consistently, but the consistency in the room environment is a requirement of what's occurring in the end. So when our machine is prior to transfer at 17, 18, 19 days of incubation, we have a high demand on the ventilation system. We want the air entering that machine to be at the right temperature in order to aid cooling. We also want that air to be at the correct humidity in order to aid moisture loss. And we want that air to be at the correct volume so we don't over-influence the machine. And so it still becomes a requirement of consistency. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the different types of ventilation systems that I see when I travel around the hatcheries, and we'll talk a little bit about how they work. I travel extensively in the Americas, North America, Central America, South America. I've spent quite a bit of time of my career in Europe as well. But to begin with, in the Americas, we see a lot of typical HVAC units. That's a heating, ventilation, air conditioning unit all wrapped up in one, as we discussed earlier. With that, once we size the unit, it provides a certain set CFM on a per ton basis. It utilizes recirculated air from the room, and therefore that becomes a function of criticalness, but that also requires excessive air filtration changes. Generally, in a unit like this, it will have filters in the unit on the roof, inside of the unit. When we look at how that's ducted into a facility, you can see that in here, this is the supply duct, and here is the return, and there's another set of filters. So the air comes in from this duct, and then it gets recirculated back through this duct. So one of the disadvantages of these systems that I see is you put one in brand new, you come back a year later, internally in the unit can be very dirty because all of the chick down and fluff and dust that comes in on eggs and dust that's created in the environment all get pulled into the unit. Even though it has a set of filters, it will still get up into that ducting. So the ducting on these systems get very dirty. Typical with units like this, you'll have multiple units on a roof. A room will have to have inputs and output module, but generally you've got temperature sensing, humidity sensing, pressure in the plenum. You got to control the plenum fan and connectivity to the HVAC unit. So all of these functions are controlled by the one unit. So from a maintenance standpoint, it can require quite a bit of effort in order to keep a system like this operating well. When we look at the next type of system, what we're seeing today is I see modular type systems where instead of having smaller individual units that you may have 30 on the roof of a hatchery or 30 on the ground around a hatchery, these larger modular systems generally only are made up of a few units, maybe 4 or 5 units. So you'll have a unit for incubator rooms, you'll have a unit for hatcher rooms, you'll have a unit for chick rooms, you'll have another unit for processing areas. And so a pretty good sized hatchery, you may have 4 or 5 of these units total, but in essence, you have a lot more control because each unit is designed specific for that area of requirement. And these systems are becoming a lot more popular in gaining popularity in the Americas. And they've been a popular piece of equipment here in Europe as well, but we're seeing some increased popularity there. Obviously, it provides fresh air to the room that's specific and designed for that room. It's 100% fresh air. There is no recirculation, so we just got rid of the dirt. We just got rid of the possibilities of bacteria contamination in the ducting. It requires minimum air filter changes because now you only have 1 set of filters in that unit and not 30 units on the roof where it has 2 sets of filters, one down below and one up above. When you look at a system like this, typical ducting for this system is that you have that duct that runs overhead and feeds the multiple rooms. And generally, we see air distribution in a room is simply nothing more than a ceiling mounted register. And with a system like this, because it controls air into the room at a defined temperature, then you can have smaller rooms. We can build a room today where you have a drop ceiling. So we see rooms like this today where the top of the incubator here, and you have a drop ceiling, and you see the air registers in the ceiling. So it becomes much easier to clean. It's a much more controlled system, a much cleaner environment. When you look at the next type of system that is fairly new, and when I say fairly new, it's less than 10 years old, but you're looking at package systems today. Companies that are building units that have the chilled water tanks, hot water or warm water and cold water, and it has the boilers built into it, the main air fan, but you have one of these that covers a large area of the hatchery, but it also provides air to setter rooms, hatcher rooms, chick processing, all of the rooms. So with this, you see one unit, you see a connectivity of a duct that goes into the building and feeds the whole hatchery. Typical installation. What you need to recognize here, this is a hatchery that was in the U.S. where they put in one of these types of units. But look at the other part of the hatchery over here. Look at all of this equipment up on the roof. So there's your comparison. So this is a lot of maintenance, a lot of filtration, a lot of work, and you only have the one unit here that requires, but it takes care of another big wing of the hatchery. The next level is basically what we reference to and what I see a lot of here in Europe. It is what's known as a central ventilation system. You essentially have one central point in the hatchery where all of your ventilation equipment is at. It brings in all the fresh air through one entry point, and then it's ducted throughout the facility. Typical for this is that this equipment is set platformed, oftentimes in a building, where that equipment will set up on this platform, and you'll see commonly for once the building is done, it's just a one big fresh air intake, one set of filters. It's also generally the equipment has a larger control type system that goes along with that, and that ducting is all insulated, easy to get to for maintenance, easy to access. You don't have to have a contractor inside of the hatchery. They can be up in that attic space. Big central chiller systems that go along with this generally are located outside, depending on how cold the climate is. Oftentimes we see them put in the building as well, but that's what this is a chiller plant for that system. When we talk about the modular systems, the central systems, the packaged unit systems, I think one of the most critical things is the controls. And here's how I oftentimes explain that. A ventilation system itself is like a race car. And so you get what you invest in. And if you want to win the race, you buy a good car. But in order to be competitive with that car, you have to hire a good driver, right? And that's what the control system is. The control system is your driver of your ventilation. And so when we talk about ventilation today, it's easy to discuss the different types, the basics of design, but I can't stress enough how important it is to have a good control system. And you want a system that gives you the awareness of the speeds of pumps, also the control of all of the environment, and all at one computer. Easier to access, easier to maintain, easier to go home and look at it on your phone, and therefore you know what's going on in your facility at all times. And the graphing capabilities of systems today, again, this is your driver. You've hired a good, you bought a good car, you got to have a good driver. So the graphing capabilities of knowing all of your environment that's going on is very critical. And last but not least, we talked earlier about what ventilation provides us, and this is, I think a lot of people probably have some familiarity with this, but this is just the basis of a heat recovery system, where the cold water is provided to the incubation equipment. The warm return water is here. If it's cold outside, this warm water is taken through this fresh air intake. Therefore, if it's cold, that air is heated by the embryonic heat that's in that water. So as that occurs, the water then returns and it's colder. So we've removed mechanical load from the chiller. We've essentially heated up our fresh outside air at a low cost. And so that's the basis of a heat recovery system. Any questions?
Vamos a ir subiendo las preguntas, por favor, acordaros.
En aviForum.org Vais subiendo las preguntas. Vamos a ver si tenemos alguna pregunta. La pregunta dice: ¿qué valores mínimos de ventilación deben de tenerse en la sala de espera de los pollitos?
Yeah, the ventilation values in a chick room, and the thing about a chick room is there's a drastic difference in how people design chick rooms. I see some of them that are narrow and long, and some that are just big square. So we know the first important thing in a chick room is providing airflow to the chicks, because we can hold chicks in a very cold climate with no air and they will get hot. We can spread the chicks out and move plenty of air and have a high temperature and still be successful at maintaining vent temps. So when it comes to a chick room, generally we focus in the neighborhood of providing a minimum of about 20 CFM per 1,000 chicks. And then depending on the ambient conditions of the hatchery is what determines the size of heating or cooling that's required to heat that or cool that 20 CFM per 1,000 chicks. So if you're going to hold, let's say 100,000 chicks in a room, then we do the math simply, and there's a couple of thousand CFM that we have to provide into that room for oxygen, and then we have to condition that 2,000 CFM in order to provide the adequate temperature. And then we have to create an air circulation pattern in the room to allow that air to be introduced to the chick. So we got to have the oxygen control, we got to have the humidity high enough where we don't cause dehydration, but we've got to get the airflow correct through the chicks in order to keep them from overheating and have the oxygen available to them. And so it's all very dependent upon the size of the room and the layout of the room and how the chicks are held in there.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Cómo valora el exceso de tiempo en la ventana de nacimiento para la ventilación de la nacedora? No estaba en el micrófono, perdón. La pregunta dice: ¿cómo valora el exceso de tiempo en la ventana de nacimiento para la ventilación en la nacedora?
Generally, in a hatcher machine, I always look at a hatcher machine because there's 4 things that occur in a hatcher, or 4 stages. In the beginning, we have an egg, and then the chick begins to externally pip. This is our second point, and as this occurs, we see higher levels of humidity in the hatcher machine occur. The third process that's happening is once we've reached peak humidity in the hatcher, we go through what's referenced as a dry down phase, because there's a lot of moisture on the chicks and you've got to get that level of moisture out of there. And then the fourth thing becomes chick holding. And so typically on a graph and a hatcher machine, we start to see the humidities increase at about 20 hours prior to pull time. We see the peak of that humidity occur about 16 hours prior to pull time, and our dry down phase occurs from the 16 hours down to about 8 hours prior to pull, and that's that dry down time. And then the last 8 hours is essentially our chick holding, our curing time, allow the navels to heal. But the focus there becomes around maintaining a temperature in the machine to keep the vent temps on the chicks adequate. And the focus that I always look at is making sure that during that process you not only measure vent temps at pull, but you measure them a few hours before pull. You want to make sure you're not overheating the chicks at that time. But generally, the hatcher machine may run a set point of 96.8, maybe 97, 97.1. It depends on, a lot of times, the age of the flock, whether it's a young flock or a very old flock. But in essence, you're looking for a vent temp. You never want to exceed 104.8 or 105 degree vent temp on the chick. And so oftentimes I see hatcheries that run the hatcher machine temps way too low. Yes, the vent temps look good, but the chicks are cold and they're burning energy to stay warm. And you'll see chicks in the hatchery that are up and they're active. And they're not active because they're hot, they're active because they're cold. And so that's something to pay attention to. We focus a lot today on trying to keep the vent temps low, but you don't want to run them too low because you burn up too much energy. Okay. Thank you very much.
Bueno, vamos a pasar a nuestro segundo ponente, es el profesor emérito de Cupier. El profesor de Cupier hoy en día es consultor avícola internacional, trabaja en el departamento de biosistemas, en división animales de producción, en la Facultad de Bioingeniería de la Universidad de Bélgica y también es profesor extraordinario en la Universidad de Wageningen en Holanda. Con nosotros el doctor de Cupier, que nos hablará de factores que afectan a la duración del desarrollo, posibilidades de sincronización en la eclosión. Con nosotros el profesor de Cupier, por favor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's first express myself to thank the organization for inviting me and for still inviting me, although I am 5 years retired now. So, I was asked to talk about the biology of hatch. So, to some extent, my talk will be very fundamental, but also with some practical aspects. Fundamental biology of hatch and why there is so much difference in time of hatch between different chicks, between different flocks. What can we do about it? And can we try to predict the time of hatch? So that will be my talk. The first thing is that I go with you through the overall factors influencing development. Just to see what kind of variation do we have. Variation that also affects total developmental time. And the first thing is that when does development start? As you all know, and I think most of you are veterinarians or agriculture engineers, so some of these things may be a freshing up, and if it's not a freshing up, you just have to listen carefully now. But some points will be quite theoretical, but be patient. Yeah? The development starts when the ovum is fertilized in the infundibulum. And between the time of fertilization and the time of oviposition, you see that you have a number of factors that will influence development during egg and shell formation. And there is variation already there. There is variation in the duration of egg formation, because not all eggs are formed during the same length of time. Sometimes it may be 24 hours, sometimes 25 and a half. So there is some variation in it. And there may be variation in body temperature of the hens according to the region where you are in, according to the temperature of the stable. These two sources of variation are function also of the age of the hen and the number, even the number of the egg in the sequence. That means that these sources of variation makes that at oviposition, the embryo that is in the egg before you start incubation may have 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, even 80,000 cells already. That means a variation between 40 and 80,000 is from single to double. So you have already a variation in development before you start incubation at the moment of oviposition. But when eggs are laid, and before they are collected to be transported to the storage house, you also may have a variation in time and a variation in conditions between the oviposition and the pre-incubation holding. It depends on your management, for example. How many times per day you collect the eggs in the stable. And some of the eggs may be laid just after you leave the stable. Others are collected half an hour before they are laid, or after they have been laid. That means you have variation there. And the variation depends also on the conditions in the stable and the nest conditions. There was a good PhD in Wageningen on the influence of the isolating power of the nest and the nest conditions in variation at the time you get the eggs to the storage room. So another source of variation. And then between the storage of eggs and the starts of incubation, you have another source of variation. Variation in the holding conditions. Variation in time. How long do we store the eggs? 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, even 2 weeks sometimes. Variation in time. And variation in the holding conditions, especially humidity, gaseous environment, and the most important is not on, I forgot to put it on, is temperature. The temperature of storage. And there is a rule of Fist that says the longer you store the eggs, the longer you have to go with your holding temperature conditions. Yes? We can discuss that later, that's not the topic of my talk today. It's not all, because then you put the eggs with all these sources of variation in the incubator, and there again you have all the factors that were discussed, some of them by the previous speaker, factors like temperature, turning, gaseous environment, humidity, egg orientation, even light, all these variation, all these sources of variation, you control them. Here you control them well, but even if you try to control them, they are still not completely uniform. Just think of the temperature. We know that in big incubators there are some temperature gradients. So these factors, together with and in interaction with all the others, they may indeed make that there is a variation in development and developmental speed, and therefore also the variation in hatching time. Then you have handling and transportation, the conditions about it, after hatching and before placement at the farm. These are another source of variations which are not the purpose of my talk today, but which may be of importance in terms of quality of chicks and the growth and performance later on. Just give an I would like to give a kind of examples in here. If the flock age, for example, increases, we know that the embryo weight, because of the egg weight, is increasing. The embryo and chick weight is increasing, but incubation time is decreasing. Hatchability is decreasing, and the pH of the albumin is increasing. It's less of importance for the moment now. If we increase the storage time, the embryo weight decreases, incubation time increases, hatchability decreases, so some points are equal as an effect for flock age and storage time, others are just the opposite. Yeah? And pH of the albumin is increasing as well. So two factors that are of main importance in determining hatch time, flock age, storage time. But you see in terms of incubation time that they have opposite effects. Increasing flock age, decreasing time of hatching, increasing storage time, increasing time of hatch. Yes? Just a couple of examples of relative humidity that may influence incubation, turning, position of eggs, and so on. Broiler, breeder flock, and storage conditions. And if we add another factor, for example, if we increase the CO2 during the first week of incubation, as is done in the biostream incubators of Petersheim, then we know that early hypercapnia will increase the embryo weight, will decrease the incubation time, increase the hatchability. But if you combine it with different storage times, with different flock ages. All these influences they are hard to predict what the effect on hatching time or incubation time will be. These are a couple of examples. Let's try to understand now what is happening at hatching and what is hatching in fact. And the whole hatching process and its preparation and control is in fact a transition. It's a transition, as you all know, from an aqueous environment to a dry environment, to an air environment. It's also a transition from allantoic respiration to lung respiration. It's also a transition from a poikilotherm, a cold-blooded state, to a warm-blooded or a homeothermic state in the chicken. Yes? And it's a transition from a mainly lipid source for metabolizable energy to a mainly carbohydrate source of metabolizable energy. All these transitions occur in the similar way in mammals except the last one, where it is reverse in mammals versus birds. So it's a transition in a lot of factors. And we want to understand what is happening during these last days of incubation. Yes? Just to remind you, we will talk a lot about it. The first thing that is observed and can be observed is what we call internal pipping. So at the last days of incubation, the first thing that happens is that the embryo will drink its water. Yes? So it becomes, everything that is fluid becomes absorbed into the embryo. After that is done, it pierces with its beak in the air chamber. That is internal pipping. That's the first stage of the transition of allantoic to lung respiration. Then it makes a hole in the shell, as the former speakers told. It's external pipping that you can see already in the incubator by the increase in humidity. And then you have the hatching process. And if you put it on a scheme, that's an old slide already, and we put it on the scheme, you see the first 18 days, and here are the last 2 days. So during the first, let's say, 18 days, respiration is mainly, not in the beginning, but after a while, after a couple of days, it's 100% through the chorioallantoic membrane. In other words, the lungs are not functional at all. The lungs are there, but they are not functional. And at the moment, during somewhere the 19th day, you have a hole that is made in the membrane and it's internal pipping. It comes with the beak in the air chamber. At that moment, you start to have lung respiration. But you still need the chorioallantoic membrane respiration. Why? Because when it comes with the beak in the inner air chamber, the inner air chamber is air, but it's not outside air. It's air that is very poor in oxygen and very rich in carbon dioxide. To give you an example, the air in the air shell may be 5–6% of carbon dioxide. That is a couple of 100 times more than in this room here. We should die in 5 or 10 minutes. The chicken is able to survive this very hypoxic atmosphere. Yes? And after a while, it will pierce the beak in the outside world, and there only, and only then, it comes into an oxygen-rich atmosphere, and you see the lung respiration moves up very rapidly, and chorioallantoic goes down, and you can see that chorioallantoic respiration will go down and must go down, and for a good incubation, you will see at the end that the blood is completely retracted in the embryo, and the veins and arteries on the shell, on the chorioallantoic membrane, are just dried off. Yes? And then at the end of this process, you have the real hatching movement there. So that is what is happening in terms of transition. In this whole of transition, in all these processes, during this here, from this line to this line, so at the start of internal pipping until hatching, that's also the stage where you have the transition from a poikilotherm to a homeothermic state. In other words, you have the thermoregulation curve that just does like this. Yeah? In 24 hours, this is established. Just in 24 hours. So a lot of things are happening. And what are the driving forces behind this? There are two systems. It's mainly endocrine controlled, and the two systems behind this are two hormonal axes. And now comes a more theoretical part. It is the thyroid axis and it is the stress axis or the corticosteroid axis. These are the two hormonal systems that control most of these events. Just to give you an example, if you start to take off chickens from the beginning until the end of hatching, and you take some chickens at just newly hatched in the beginning of the hatch curve, that means since the hatching start, the first chicks that hatch, or after 10 hours when the hatch started, and you still pull off some of these chicks that just hatched, but in the middle of the hatching curve, and you look at the thyroid hormone levels, the ones that are here, yeah, are quite high in thyroxine and triiodothyronine. The ones that hatch later, after the hatch started, they have lower levels of thyroid hormones. In other words, you see that already in the level of thyroid hormones. The late hatches, they have lower thyroid hormone levels, and that's also the reason why they hatch later. Yeah. Now, why these thyroid hormones are important? They are important for a lot of things. They are important for yolk sac retraction. If they are low, then the yolk sac retraction before the actual hatching occurs goes much more difficult, and when you have very late hatches, you often see that the yolk is not completely retracted. That's one of these processes. It also helps the transition from chorioallantoic to lung respiration, and it does that in two ways. First of all, in interaction with the corticosteroid axis, I will talk on that in a minute, but also because it let go the blood to the lungs at that moment. Because before, during the whole incubation, blood is not going to the lungs, or hardly. It goes to the shell where the respiration takes place. It has to go to the lungs because at that moment you need vasodilatation of the lungs. And in this vasodilatation of the lungs, you need kinins, like the kallikrein system in humans or in mammals. In birds is the ornithokinin system. And in the ornithokinin system, you have a couple of enzymes that are under thyroid control. So even there, your thyroid hormones play a quite crucial role. This is just to remind you the thyroid axis with the hypothalamal thyroid system. Yeah? And the feedback on this, just to remember you, there is interaction between the stress axis and the thyroid axis in that sense that the stress hormones and the stress axis, that means the corticosteroid axis, influences the ACTH and the corticosteroids, but also influences the thyrotropic system. So it will also be stimulated by this stress axis. And why is that of some importance? Because what we call stress in the embryo, they need it. They need it again for the start of lung respiration. Because lung respiration cannot take place until there is blood flowing to the lungs, but also it cannot take place until you have deployment of the lungs. That means that the lungs should go open, in other words, should be able to take in air. And they are not able to take in air until you have a decrease in the pressure of the walls of the lungs. And this is made possible by the fact that you have surfactant that is lining up the inner part of the alveoli, the inner part of the lungs. And this lung surfactant to lower the surface tension in the lungs, which is critical also in newborns, in mammals, in humans. If there is a critical thing in newborn humans, it is air, it is oxygen. That's, if you have a premature baby, it has to go to the room where they can receive oxygen. Why? Because the lungs are not open enough yet, because there is a lack of surfactant synthesis. Well, in this surfactant synthesis, you need stress factors. You need the corticosteroids. Yes? These corticosteroids, they are responsible for this for this lowering of the surface tension in the lungs. And this is a complicated picture because these two axes, they are interacting with each other. They are interacting with each other in that sense that in the embryo, and only in the embryo, the stress factors, they will stimulate the thyroid system, and they will stimulate the essential conversion of thyroxine to its active component that is responsible for the increase in metabolism. So if you do not have glucocorticoids, you will not only have no surfactant, so no opening of the lungs, but you will also lack the conversion of thyroxine to the active component that is responsible for the increase in energy metabolism. This one is not active for energy metabolism. It's only this one. And for this one, you need also the stimulation of these corticosteroids. Say that there is a close interaction. It's quite complicated, but a close interaction. After hatching, in a day-old chick or 2-day-old chick, this completely falls away. And then the stress factors will not stimulate, they will inhibit this conversion. It's exactly the same in sheep, in calves, in man, in rats, and also in chickens. So the interaction of the stress axis, the glucocorticoids, and the thyroid system completely changes and even reverses. Before birth, just before birth, it's a stimulatory effect of the stress factor on the thyroid system. After birth, it's an inhibitory effect. What are now some factors affecting the pipping and the hatching time? And here we come to some more practical things. The first thing is that you all know, if you look at the storage time in days, that there is a linear relationship between the hatching, between incubation time, internal pipping, as well as hatching time. The longer you store them, the longer time it takes before they start pipping and before they start hatching. If you take, and here I take some time to explain it to you, if you take the time of internal pipping, how much time, how much hours they are in the stage of internal pipping, how much time they are in the stage of external pipping, and how much time does the whole hatching process takes place. And you see 4 colors here. We take here eggs that have been stored for 3 days. And these are eggs that have been stored for 18 days. The blue one is young broiler breeders. The brown one, old broiler breeders. 38, 58 weeks. 38, 58 weeks. The same here, the same there, and so on. What do we see? We see that there is an effect in internal pipping, the duration of internal pipping, due to storage time. You see the difference between these dark colors and these ones. Yes? So internal pipping takes more time. It's longer in that stage of internal pipping if you store them for a long time. If we look at the time of external pipping, we don't see the effect of storage time. We see the effect of age. Old broiler breeders, they are longer in the stage of external pipping than young broiler breeders. And here, the same for the eggs that have been stored on 18 days. In other words, it's not that easy. It's not that easy that the factors that are controlling internal pipping and the factors that are controlling external pipping, the duration of external pipping or hatching, are all the same. They are not the same. We have to make difference. In other words, there are factors that are governing more internal pipping. There are other factors that are governing or controlling more external pipping. Which ones? Well, briefly, for internal pipping, the most important is the gaseous control. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the egg and hence in the air chamber. For external pipping, no, there the most important factors are the level of thyroid hormones in the blood of the embryo. And we know that for all broiler breeders, this level of thyroid hormones is lower than for young broiler breeders. And therefore, the process of external pipping takes more time. For internal pipping, we know that if you store eggs for a long time, the developmental processes are slowed down, also the metabolism is slowed down, so that the level of carbon dioxide in the egg is lower for eggs that have been stored for a long time before incubation, and therefore they hatch later, but also the duration of internal pipping is longer. So there are different factors that are coming into play. And just to show it to you, if you take 3 days storage or 18 days storage, at the moment of internal pipping here, you see the level of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the egg. Yeah? For young broiler breeders, for all broiler breeders. The difference is not between the age, the difference is between the time of storage. Just to give you an idea about the complexity of it. Now, increased time between hatch and first food also affects and retards a number of parameters which may be of importance. That is the yolk utilization, development of the gastrointestinal tract, metabolic level, immune system development, and the overall postnatal development. That's a talk on its own, and I will not focus on this, but the time between hatch and the first food affects a lot of these factors. We can come to that into discussion. And they are interacting with the duration of incubation. And this I want to show with this graph. It's again, young broiler breeders stored for 3 days or 18 days, all broiler breeders stored for 3 days and 18 days. And you see 2 columns. The gray one is without food at hatch, and the dark one is when they are fed immediately at hatch. And we see the relative growth during the first week. All the time, when they are fed immediately after hatch, their growth is more rapid, is increased in the dark ones. But if you have a closer look, the difference between these two here and between these two there it's bigger than here. Here as well, it's bigger than there. In other words, the effect of feeding your chicks immediately after hatch or not feeding, well, you have a bigger effect if your chicks are coming out of eggs that have been stored for a long time. So there is an interaction between the storage time on the one hand and feeding after hatch immediately or delayed feeding after hatch on the other hand. Why? And it's quite simple to explain this. If you store them for a short time or a long time, if you store them for a long time, your hatching curve, your hatching window will be broader. That's your hatching window. If you store them for a short time, your hatching window is more narrow, is sharper. And the first feeding is here. But what do we say? What the end of hatch is? The end of hatch is for us here. That is when you open the hatches in practice, when the workman starts to come in, you open your hatches and you say, that's the end of hatch. That's the end of hatch here. And the time between the end of hatch and first feeding, that's the time. Yes, for your management, but not for biology. For biology, the time between hatch and first feeding, as a mean, is this line. This is the median line for the end of hatching of this curve. This is the median line of hatching of this curve and first feeding. So you have to look at these distances here and these distances there. And for the individual chicks, it's even worse, because here you have already chicks that have been hatched, and they can stay in the hatchery for 1 day, 1.5, even 2 days. And if there is a gap between what you say, what the end of hatch is, and the first feeding, the time between here and there may be 48, 50 hours and more. So, because long storage duration gives you a broader hatch window, therefore the median, the difference between the median and the first feeding will always be higher than if you have a synchronization of hatch. And that's why in a long storage duration you have more effect of very early feeding than if you have really synchronized hatching. That's how biology and management interacts with each other. Just something else, if you have hypoxia in your incubation, or if you incubate at high altitudes, all the time you see at high altitude incubation, and I hear that there are some people of South America here, you may face this. In hypoxia, hatching is earlier. Why hatching is earlier? Because hypoxia is mimicking what you see in the blue graph here. It is when you inject stress factors, dexamethasone as a stress factor, well, it is mimicking what you see during hypoxia. And the stress factor influences and helps the chick to hatch early. You can see that also in the plasma corticosteroid levels. If you have hypoxia, it's a middle graph, it's higher at 16 days, it's higher at 20 days compared to control. And the blue one is the dex-injected chickens in these experiments. And you can see that also in the total phospholipids in the blood, the desaturated phospholipid cholesterols, the dry lung weight, all these factors in the lungs, not in the blood, sorry. You see that at day 16, total phospholipids in the lungs and desaturated phospholipids, they are much higher, they are even double. So you stimulate these surfactants, these are parts of the surfactant, you stimulate these surfactants so much earlier due to these corticosteroids. This is the same information here in DEX-treated or T3-treated animals. Storage duration. I told you already, duration of internal pipping. You see what the difference? Huh? Duration of external pipping is almost the same, and the duration from the setting to IP, therefore, is somewhat longer. So it's especially the duration of internal pipping that has been increased by this long storage period. When you look at the stress axis, again, during internal pipping for long storage, it's lower. And this lower corticosterone results in lower T3 levels, and these two axes, corticosterone and T3, they are responsible for the main of these events. Once they are newly hatched, everything returns to normal. There is even a kind of recuperation, and you see even higher levels then of these two hormones. That's for my second part. What about prediction of hatching time? With all this, can we do something with the prediction of hatching time? And now I come to something totally different. We try to look at what are factors that could help in prediction hatching time. And we used a couple of techniques which are called acoustic resonance analysis and optical techniques. I will mainly talk about this acoustic resonance analysis. What is this technique? It is just tapping on the X. It is a technique that is used for crack detection. That's why we use this technique. We developed such a technique in tapping on the X and listening to the X. And if you do that, if you tap on the X, you create a sound. And if you have this sound, you can analyze the peaks in hertz. Yes? What we do. So the noise signal is transformed into a resonance frequency. And again, it's a technique used in commercial crack detectors in consumption X, and now I think most of the selection companies are using these techniques as well for eggshell strength. Because eggshell strength is mainly measured as a static eggshell strength, but the dynamic eggshell strength is even more important for having cracks, because most of the cracks in the eggs are obtained because of the rolling of the eggs through the chain. Yes? Now, if you use this technique during incubation, and that's what we did, and that was an original thing, so you see the resonance frequency here. During the first 300 hours of incubation, that means during the first week or 10 days of incubation, then you have a steadily, slightly going up of this resonance frequency of the eggs in the incubator. And the same slope here, you find here. Yes? The warming up of the eggs and the loss of mass, because during incubation the egg loses water, as we all know. Well, these loss of mass causes a very slight going up of the resonance frequency. But it was to our surprise that always and only with fertilized eggs, not with not fertilized eggs, or not with embryos that died in the first days of incubation. But in all other cases, you have a very steep drop in resonance frequency, a sudden decrease of this resonance frequency somewhere between 94 hours of incubation and 108 hours of incubation. Always, but with a variation. What is happening? What is happening is that around 108 hours of incubation, you have a moving waterfront. It means that at that moment, the embryo, which is close to the yolk, will form a sac, a water sac, because egg bird embryos are amniotes, so they develop in a water sac, but there is no water sac in the beginning of incubation. It develops during early incubation, but it develops exactly at 4 days of incubation. And this water has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? It comes from the albumen. So it attracts water from the albumen to the embryo, so that the embryo forms now a water sac on top of the yolk. And due to that, the albumen around here is drying up a bit, and there is a moving waterfront until it reaches the shell. Well, this moving waterfront is detected by resonance frequency. So we can detect that by knocking on the eggs. And that's what we did. So acoustic resonance analysis conclusion, it gives you information about fertility, 100% all or none, for sure, and it gives you an idea on the speed of growth during the early embryonic stages that can be found. Yeah. Therefore, the start of decrease here can give you a prediction model with the parameters built in, that is the size of the egg built in, can give you a prediction model of the speed of development and of the hatch time. And we build it in the incubator in that way. You see 2 robot arms, and these 2 robot arms, it's an experimental unit, they knocked on the eggs every 10 minutes so that we could follow this resonance frequency during incubation without opening the incubator. That's how we proceed with that. And just to make it brief to you, if you look at the measured time of incubation, so the predicted time on the measured time, sorry, of the end of incubation, and the predicted time of incubation, that is the graph you get. That means that for about the R square is 0.79, the determination coefficient, that means close to 80% of the total incubation duration can be predicted already at 4 to 5 days of incubation. That means the length of incubation time is mainly due to factors from the beginning on, from the early, from the start of incubation. And some factors also play a bit at the end. That's why you don't have 100%. Yeah? But the main length of incubation is to some extent already late in the eggs when you start with. And part of the variation is also due to factors during incubation. In the beginning, during storage, but during incubation, and during the end of incubation. But the biggest variation is explained already in the beginning of incubation by this model. Now, for the last 5 minutes, I come to my 4th point. What are now intrinsic factors? Factors that have nothing to do with the condition of incubation, but other factors that play a role in the length of incubation time and in the hatch time, in other words. These are embryonic characteristics that may be due to something totally different. And I limited it here in a couple of examples I will give to you to the susceptibility to the ascites syndrome in broilers. And what we did, in fact, because we knew already by older work that if you select in different ways, we select for what? We select for meat, we select for efficiency of meat production, we select for egg production. All these very pronounced selection, does it not affect development and developmental processes? And to some extent it does. And what if you did, and that's an interesting question, which is only academic, what if you do the reverse? What if you select for incubation length? Has it a repercussion on your production levels? Nobody asked this question in practice, of course, yes? But some people 50 years ago in the United States, and perhaps some people know the name of Boren and Crittenden, they did such experiments in layers. They selected layers for incubation length. And you can, because there is a genetic component in the duration of development, just as it is in cows or in sheep, also in birds. So you can select for incubation length. If you do that in layers, yes, and if you have selected for longer incubation or shorter, if you select for longer incubation length, you don't see any effect on the laying rate. It's the same. It does not affect laying rate, but the efficiency of egg production increases. The efficiency of egg production increases. So, what we did was, with, at that time, hybro, it doesn't exist anymore because copper and hybro merged. If we used hybro birds, broilers, that were selected for ascites resistance or ascites sensitivity, indirectly, not directly, we incubated them. And all the time, when you do that, you see that for the ascites sensitive lines, and this is incubation time and the percentage of eggs hatched, you see that the hatching curve moves to later incubation. Yeah? Sensitive lines, they hatch later. Always, the ascites sensitive lines hatch later. What it has to do and how can we explain in it? And what you see here is plasma thyroid hormones, again, yes, at external pipping and at hatching. This is for thyroxine, this is for triiodothyronine. All the time, in all these graphs, I don't have to go too much in detail, you see that if you look at external pipping stage or at hatching stage, the ascites sensitive lines, they have lower thyroid hormone levels. Because of these lower thyroid hormone levels, they hatch later. But what has it to do with ascites resistance or ascites sensitivity now? Well, how come? There's another thing I should tell you. The ascites sensitive lines, why should we keep them? We shouldn't keep them because they are sensitive to ascites. But they have a better performance, not in terms of growth, but in terms of feed conversion efficiency. So therefore we start to look at feed conversion efficiency differences between different selected broiler lines. And all the time, when you have more feed efficiency, efficient birds, they start to have lower thyroid hormone levels. Why is that? If you select for feed efficiency, you will select for lines that have less fat, of course. But if you start your selection for feed efficiency at early stages, 2 weeks onwards they start, in practice, in selection companies. At 1 or 2 weeks of age, broilers, they do not have very much fat. Can you then select for feed efficiency at that age? Yes, you can, because feed efficiency is not only determined by fat, but is also determined by the level of metabolism, the metabolic level, the resting metabolic level. And you know that in broilers, half of your feed you burn up in your metabolism. So if you select for birds that have a lower resting metabolic metabolism, you will have more efficient lines. And they did, and they were very successful in that. But if you do that, then you have to realize what are the main factors that control the level of your resting metabolism. The main factors are, again, in us, as well as in chickens, your thyroid hormone levels, because thyroid hormone levels are the main actors in the level of metabolism. So, by selecting for very efficient broilers, we have in fact selected for slightly hypothyroid broilers. And if they are slightly hypothyroid, we may not be surprised that they hatch somewhat later. If they hatch somewhat later, then they stay in the egg a little bit longer. And especially during the last days of incubation, the level of hypoxic atmosphere in the egg is so high that half a day can make a critical difference for susceptibility in ascites. You know how you can make birds ascitic? Very easy. You take a strip of tape in the secretary, and such a small strip of 3 to 4 centimeters, you stick it on the eggs. 20–30% of your birds will become ascitic, because they are in a too high carbon dioxide rich atmosphere at the end of incubation. If you make it that way, that your birds are longer and perhaps too long in this hypoxic carbon dioxide rich atmosphere, then indeed they will become ascitic. We made it also by putting them in a somewhat higher carbon dioxide atmosphere, and you see, for example, the ascites mortality. The red ones are the ascites sensitive ones, the blue ones are ascites resistant ones. By putting them in a little bit higher CO2 atmosphere on a continuous level, you see that ascites mortality is ending up to 30%. And you can see that also in the API index, that is the cardiovascular index, right ventricle versus total ventricle. Yeah? You see here the red ones compared to these the red ones higher than the blue ones here. But we also did it by putting them in a normoxic or hypoxic carbon atmosphere at the end of incubation. So if you give pulses of carbon dioxide in the incubator, then you make them a kind of resistant, yeah? And then you decrease. You have the opposite effect. So it's a play, in fact. It's a play between giving them pulses so that they can come out earlier, or giving them a continuous stress factor, and then you have the reverse, and you have more ascites susceptibility. So your hatching time in that way is also influenced by genetic factors, and these genetic factors and length of incubation can be linked to ascites sensitivity. That's an overall factor, but I see my time is 0, so all these factors taken together means that chick development and growth results of multiple factors. Time of hatch, time of access to feed are important, and they are function of pre-incubation conditions, incubation conditions, as well as of genetic factors. And I stop with the excuse if I use too much of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, aprovechar para dar las gracias al patrocinador, el señor Peter Sainz, que nos ha traído al profesor, que ha sido una charla realmente muy interesante. Preguntas, vamos a ver. Profesor.
Yeah. The third question.
Yeah. I ask this question because sometimes I hear in a kind of marketing way that incubation is much more important today. Because if you look at the total length of development of a broiler, 40 days, well, years ago, it was 80 days, 60 days, 40 days, 38 days. So the growth speed increases all the time. Yes? Incubation time, it's always 21 days. It didn't change. That means that your length in total development for broiler production is from day 0 until 40 days postnatally. That means that incubation takes 1/3, even more than 1/3. So it becomes more important. I don't like that. I don't like that because for me, it's a kind of marketing talk. It has nothing to do with that, in fact. your incubation becomes more important, not because of the proportion of time for total broiler development is more incubation now than 50 years or 20, 30 years ago. It has nothing to do with that, because your incubation time hardly changes by selection for eggs or for meat. Yeah? And you cannot compare that. Incubation is for 90% differentiation and development. And it's only the last 2 or 3 days that you have growth of the broiler in the egg. And even then, the growth in the egg, you cannot completely compare it with the growth after hatch, postnatal. So why is incubation then becomes more important? And the factors that control the incubation, why they become more important? Not because of this time and the proportion of time it takes in the total developmental process of a broiler, but because we know that what you are doing during incubation has an effect on your postnatal development. And before we thought, when you have a good hatch, it's okay. And for the rest, we don't have to care. The more chicks you can sell, and they are of a relatively good quality, that's all what matters. Well, it is not all what matters, because what you are doing during incubation, even if you have an equal good hatchability, one batch will perform better than the other. And you cannot explain it by differences in developmental time or by difference in hatchability, because it's a good hatchability. Well, now we come to know that what you are doing during incubation has an effect, even on the same genetic potential, has an effect on postnatal performance by processes what we call epigenetics. That means that the way how genes are transcribed are influenced by processes during incubation, and some of these processes may just simply be physical processes. In other words, temperature, for example, or carbon dioxide during early incubation, or other factors, they may change the way how you have transcribed genes into messenger RNA and into proteins. And they can affect, to a small extent perhaps, but they can affect later life. Therefore, what is happening during incubation becomes more important now than we thought before. Not because of these length of development, and that's also why, sustained selection, it hardly changed incubation time. Yeah?
¿Otra pregunta? Seguimos en inglés.
Ideal time, that's another question. Ideal time between hatch and first feed. Well, I think there is a lot to do. First of all, we have to, as I explained, we have to well define what, if you speak about ideal time between hatch and first feeding, what is hatch? Yeah? And what is the end of hatch, as I explained? Is it the hatch of the whole batch, or the individual hatch of the chicken? Yeah? Is it this, if it is the management development, definition of the end of hatch, then it's when you open the hatches. Then I should say, the shorter you can make the time between the hatch and the first feeding, the better. Also, the first 6 hours, it's not that much of influence. But if you make it 1 day, you have to realize that some of the chickens will be in the hatch already for a day or 2 days, perhaps. Yes? You know that. But when we look at the biological definition of hatch, individual chickens, yes, hatch and first feeding, so you take the first hatches, the middle hatches, the late hatches, and you look what is the effect of immediate feeding or delayed feeding if you do it in that way, if you take off the chickens all the time out of the hatcher, yeah, in a biological sense, then we see that during the first 12 hours, you don't see any effect. It's only later that you see an effect. But if you make it 48 hours, 2 days, between the real biological hatch, so you take out the first hatches, you feed them or you don't feed them for 2 days. You take the middle ones, you feed them or you don't feed them. you take the late hatches, you feed them or you don't feed them, well then we see always, and we have done that in detail, that the late hatches, if you do not feed them for 2 days, they have a much greater effect, it has a much greater effect than the early hatches. In other words, early and late hatches are not the same chicks, even if they come out of the same batch of eggs. They are not the same chicks, and we see that in a number of factors. For example, we see that in hypothalamic factors that are controlling feed intake. We see clearly differences in the expression of factors that are controlling feed intake in early and late hatches, and in a number of other parameters as well. So it's a complex thing. If you ask me this question, what is the ideal time? If you ask it from a practical point of view, or if you ask it from a more biological point of view, it's already a difference. From a practical point of view, I should say, you don't have to care very much for the first 6 to 12 hours. But then, yes, so feed them as early as possible. Yes? By the way, is it important to feed them? Is it because they need the food or not? Because they have their yolks, they have their reserve, and they can live on their reserve. But what do we see in practice? All the time, when you feed them delayed or not, if you delay the feeding, you should think, oh, they have their reserve and they can use it. And it's the reverse that we see. If you delay feed, the use of yolk, the yolk utilization, is retarded instead of advanced. So they don't use up their yolk that easily. Sometimes you see that, or sometimes you do not see any difference, but I never have seen, not in our research, not in literature, that by delayed feeding they use up their yolk more quickly. Never. It's always no difference or the reverse. How comes? Well, I told you in one of my slides that hatching process is a transition. It's a transition between a lot of things. One of the transitions I didn't talk about is the transition in the source of metabolizable energy. And before birth, the main source of energy for the embryo until hatch is the fat, is the lipoproteins of the yolk. Yes? That's why the respiratory quotient of eggs, when you measure that, it's 0.7. That means it's fat burning. After they hatch, we know that the capacity of digestion, for digestion of lipids, is still relatively low. And chicks, they need about 1 week to have their full capacity for lipid digestion. How comes? Because in the process of hatch, you have a radical change also in digestive enzymes. And they have a hard time to digest these lipids until you have carbohydrates. Therefore, there is the old adagio, you have to burn fats on the fire of the carbohydrates. In other words, after hatch, if they do not have carbohydrates, they have a hard time to burn their fat reserves. And that's why their yolk reserves, they are not used up that quickly. And you see very much the difference in performance then. They lose weight. When they have food, you give them carbohydrates, and they have then the fire to burn the fat of their yolk reserves. And they use up their yolk reserves more quickly. That is what's happening after hatch. Yes? That's one. Secondly, what do we see as well? That is, when they are fed, even if the uptake is very small, and even if some birds, like ostriches or other birds, they eat whatever, even small stones and things like that, they fill, in other words, part of their gastrointestinal tract with particles. And the normal thing is food particles. Well, particles in the gastrointestinal tract, they give a stimulus for the development of the gastrointestinal tract, and you see that on the length of the video. So food has two purposes. First, food has the purpose that it brings proteins and energy and whatever. And secondly, food by itself is a stimulus. It is a gastrointestinal stimulus for gastrointestinal growth factors. And that is very often forgotten. We look at food as a thing we need, of course, as proteins, as energy, but it's more than that. Food is also a signal. It's a signal for development of this gastrointestinal tract, and that's also why the time between hatch and first feeding is important. By the way, if you give particles, if you give items in the chicken before hatch by overfeeding, you also have this effect of stimulation of the gastrointestinal tract. Why? Because before hatching, if the food is in the amnion fluid, they drink it at day 18, 19 of incubation, and by drinking it, it comes into the gastrointestinal tract, and it has a stimulatory effect there. Even if the support energy is very low, it doesn't matter. It has a stimulatory effect.
¿Vamos con la última pregunta o vamos a hablar de tiempo? Sí. Si hay alguno que haya hecho algunas preguntas, por favor, que aproveche ahora el descanso para hacérsela, porque vamos muy mal de tiempo. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, muy bien, vamos a aprovechar
45 minutos, por favor, para tomar el café y el refrigerio.